Welcome to my apprenticeship video. For my apprenticeship, I went to Clarington Central Secondary School and helped out in the Learning and Life Skills program. Learning and Life Skills is a program for special needs students aged 14 to 21. They come into the high school in grade 9, but they can stay past the 4 years and stay up until the age of 21. This program is not connected to any curriculum. They do take individual classes and do participate in Rotary just like the mainstream students. Some of the classes that I helped out in were the Healthy Choices classroom. I had an all-girls class and an all-boys class. I was in a culinary class, so practicing cooking skills, and then a social skills class. Throughout my placement, I was working alongside multiple EAs. Some classes had no EAs, while others had up to 8 or 9 EAs in one room. But I did work with students with a variety of abilities. Some were verbal, some were nonverbal, and they all used assistive technologies to communicate. Some were in wheelchairs, some were mobile, some needed help toileting, some needed help feeding. I was in a class with mostly nonverbal students, with 1 to 2, depending on the day, verbal students. I was also in classrooms that were very high functioning and all students were verbal and could communicate. For my inquiry question, I focused on classroom management. So my question was, how does classroom management strategies differ between alternate classrooms, so LLS classrooms, and mainstream classrooms? So through my research, through resources online, and through my own placements and practicum experiences, in a mainstream classroom, there are 2 types of classroom management, proactive versus reactive. For some examples, through my research, I found that proactive strategies included proximity within the students, relationship building prior to things happening, beginning of the year, classroom design or layout, modeling behavior to the students, allowing the students to co-design guidelines or rules in the classroom at the beginning of the year, and creating engaging lessons. Through my research and through my own experiences in the mainstream classroom, some reactive strategies include sending students into the hallway, ignoring the behavior altogether, or disciplining the students right then and there. Through my research, it was quite easy to find classroom management strategies for mainstream classes. However, opposite, in the alternate classrooms or the LLS classrooms, it was a little bit harder to find classroom management skills. In an alternate classroom, not all students are verbal, so it is difficult to use the same strategies. Even engaging in conversation with them, some may not understand. If they are hard of hearing, you cannot just verbally tell them, so it is difficult. And in a special needs classroom, it is difficult for classroom management skills because every child is so different and has different needs. So in the research, it is also difficult because they may tell you to do something, but what may work for one student will not always work for all students or any of your students. Through my research and through my time in my internship, I found some classroom management strategies in the Learning and Life Skills program or an alternate classroom. We're also proactive versus reactive strategies. Some of them are the same, proactive strategies. Proximity will work for some students. Relationship building, classroom design, modeling behavior. One key thing is knowing your students. So knowing what strategies work for each student, what strategies elevate behavior for some students, or some de-escalation tips. Having an agenda posted was super important in the classes that I was, and keeping the students engaged in what you're talking about. Once again, just a reminder, in both the Learning and Life Skills alternate classroom and the mainstream classroom, some of these classroom management strategies will not work for all students. You may try one, but it might not work for everyone. Some reactive strategies in the Learning and Life Skills class that I noticed, and as well as found in research, were addressing the situation right away. You cannot just leave it because most students feed off each other and will continue the behavior and it will escalate. These students did need frequent breaks or walks, so we did need to take them. However, none of these students are allowed to be left alone. So in a mainstream classroom, teachers may send students out in the hall and then go out and talk to them. We cannot do that in some of the classes in an alternate classroom. So you can't just send a student out in the hall because you can't see them. They may just leave. So we often took frequent breaks in the classrooms or walks as a whole class. And then once again, to know your students, you need to have individual student de-escalation strategies and know the students, what sets them off, and then how to de-escalate their behavior. And then sometimes you do have to just remove things from the situation. Many times students get distracted with items in the classroom. Students may grab chairs or whatever, but you might need to grab them right out of their hand if they aren't listening. And if they are nonverbal, sometimes you just need to take things away from them. Through my research and through my internship placement, I did notice that many of the classroom management strategies are similar to one another. However, it's the voice that you use and the way you're saying things to the students that differentiate each other. So in a mainstream classroom, you may be stern with the students, you may raise your voice, you may do different facial expressions. However, in the learning and life skills class, sometimes those work, but with some students, you cannot raise your voice. They will start to scream and cry. You have to be sensitive to their sensory issues. But some of the things you can use the same strategies, you just need to change your tone of voice. As one of the teachers that I was working with said, you need to talk to them like they are in kindergarten. So remind them, ask them how they are feeling and say, how do you think this makes me feel? You are hurting my feelings. Where in a mainstream classroom, that may work, but not always, especially with older kids in a secondary setting. In my placement and through my internship, I decided to use Gibbs' reflective cycle as my framework, especially when using classroom management skills, especially in an LLS or alternate program. You do need to try things over and over again. What may work for one student will not work for all students. So throughout my time in my placement, I used Gibbs' reflective cycle to gauge the strategies that I would be using to keep the classroom safe and inclusive for all. With Gibbs' reflective cycle, it moves you throughout the cycle and it allows you to try things, reflect, evaluate on how things worked, and then change them. With me being there for 5 days, I was able to see what was happening with the situation, how it made me feel, what happened, and then I got to evaluate what I chose to do. So what I did in the plan, and what strategies I used for classroom management. After that, I got to implement them into the classroom. After I implemented them into the classroom, I got to think back and reflect on what I did and if it worked or not. If it did or did not, if it didn't work, I got to change my plan, try different strategies the next day, evaluate them. The next day, I would put them into action, try a different strategy, and repeat. So if that strategy didn't work, I could reflect on it, evaluate it, and then try it again either later in that day, the next day, and I could try it with multiple different students. So Gibbs' reflective cycle allowed me to reflect on what I did, what the strategies I used, and how they worked for each individual student. Like I said, some strategies worked for one student but wouldn't work for another student. So using this framework allowed me to try multiple times and reflect on what I did and then implement it again. This can also be used in a mainstream classroom with classroom management. It can also be used in lessons by giving a lesson or implementing anything into your classroom. You can try it, reflect on how it affected the students, reflect on how it affected you as the teacher, and then try again the next day or later in the day. In the end, I did learn some classroom management strategies. I did learn that many of the strategies can be used in both a mainstream classroom and in an alternate classroom. However, you just need to change how you use those strategies, and what may work for one student may not work for all students. The research was very similar. The strategies were very similar between the two different programs, alternate classroom and a mainstream classroom.